Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I have some exciting news um, about the channel. So, I am experimenting with something new. I'm going to start a series of interviews with different experienced debaters and experienced debate coaches. I'm going to pick their brains a little bit, A, about their thoughts about debate, sort of like the interview that I had with Andrew Monteith, but B, also about the April PF topic. The second piece of news, this is not really news yet, but I'm pretty sure that I have a good grasp of which topic is going to be picked for April. Now, the votes have not happened yet, or at least they have not finished and have not been counted yet. But I'm pretty sure that most people are going to vote for the nuclear energy topic and not the corn subsidies topic. And there are kind of four reasons I think this. Number one, some people showed me that there's a poll on like the PF Discord where something like 70% of people said that they were going to vote for the nuclear energy topic. Two, I've had a lot of conversations with debaters in the US and lots of coaches as well. And it seems like most of them, if I'm not in a weird echo chamber, have sort of a shared consensus that they like the nuclear energy topic better. Three is that the nuclear energy topic has been debated before. This could be a reason that people don't vote for it because maybe that makes it boring. But I think more likely it's a reason that lots of people do vote for it because they will be able to use their back files. It's a more familiar topic. Coaches, for example, who did the March 2020 PF topic, which is virtually the same, will be able to use their old prep and be better equipped to easily coach their students. And maybe they don't want to do as much research in order to do that. And four, I do think there are good reasons to believe it is maybe a more balanced topic than the corn subsidies topic. To be fair, I haven't done very much research into corn subsidies. I sort of spent like an hour Googling around and coming up with a list of arguments on my own. And it seemed like there are some good reasons that we should remove corn subsidies. And most of the corn subsidies arguments on the other side that are in favor of keeping corn subsidies, I guess the neg, um, they mostly are grouped into categories that are more narrow than the ground on the AF. And I think this creates a bit of a skew. And also, I think that maybe people will find the corn subsidies topic slightly more boring, but my intuitions might be wrong. There is a slim chance, I think, that I'm completely wrong about this. I've got it all wrong, and the corn subsidies topic wins the vote by a landslide. There's like a significant population of coaches and students who control a lot of votes that I have no information about. But I think there is very good reason to believe that the nuclear energy topic will win the vote. As such, I'm just gonna go ahead and release some videos on the nuclear energy topic. And who knows, maybe that will be like a fifth reason that it's more likely to win. But I'm not trying to rig the vote or anything. Um, I think it will be good if it wins, though, because I think this is quite a balanced topic. I think it's pretty rich, and it has a lot of interesting arguments on both sides. I quite enjoyed debating it when I was doing so in the senior year of my high school career as well. So to that end, I have two things to say about the nuclear topic. One, I have some thoughts that I've compiled here. And two, pretty excited because I am going to interview a number of different debaters and debate coaches about the nuclear energy topic. And so the goal of this series is like, I was talking with Andrew, and I sort of talked about this in the last video, the Q&A thing as well. I think that PFers would do a lot better if they learned from other formats. And learning from policy, kind of all the rage right now, is a great thing. Learning better from policy, how we can actually apply those things to PF and make them our own, and also combining that with learning from lots of other debate formats that I think PFers are not as familiar with. And so I think that like that sounds great in the abstract, but it's really hard to put into practice, especially when you don't have a lot of connections or resources to explore these other formats. And even if you do, the resources that exist for the other formats are certainly not tailored to be very easy to explain what you can import back into PF. And so to that end, I have set up a series of maybe like a dozen or so interviews with people from a variety of very diverse debate backgrounds. And I'm going to ask all of them to give us a small snippet of their thoughts on how they would approach this topic. And so through that, I think we can very easily compare and contrast all of the variety of different ways that different experienced debaters approach the same topic. And we can see that there's like wisdom to be found in each one. And maybe we can see a better picture of how we can put together all of these interesting dogmas about debate and these interesting paradigms about how debate works. So I'm excited to do that. I'm excited to learn what other people think about the topic. And I'm also excited to tell you what I think about the topics. That was a lot of yapping to say we're going to talk a lot about nuclear energy over the next month. Okay, let's just begin. This is my topic analysis. It's worth noting this is before doing very much research. I haven't cut any cards on this topic. I did do some prep back in March 2020, like 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, I guess. Um, and so that's sort of the extent of the information that I have. But I've done some good thinking. Okay, so the topic is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. Um, there's not that much to pick apart with the words. I think it's fairly straightforward. I guess you could analyze the word domestic and you could analyze the word substantially. Substantially, there might be some definitions flying around, but I think that most of your arguments should just assume there's, a reasonably large increase in investment in domestic nuclear energy. Second thing to note about domestic, this just means that you can't make arguments that like the US will create nuclear energy in other countries. It probably also excludes arguments like we should make more nuclear reactors for like submarines or powering like other military vehicles. I'm not sure if that would count as domestic, although there's probably some weirdness of the terms of art with like domestic military assets being used in other papers. The third thing to note about the wording of this topic and how it's different from the wording of past topics that were similar is it says investment in, which means we're not necessarily increasing the amount of actual energy output. We're increasing the input into that energy, the financial input, which means this topic is open to sort of nibs from the neg, especially, that says even if we invest a lot of money into domestic nuclear energy, it might not actually produce energy. So I'm thinking sort of the same vibes as the high-speed rail topic last year, I guess, where a lot of teams started using a strategy by the end of the topic where in rebuttal, for instance, they would have like five different nibs that were like necessary but insufficient burdens for the AF, where they said, like, here are a bunch of reasons why, even if we significantly invest in high speed rail construction, maybe the high speed rail never gets built. Or if it does, it's like 20 or 30 years down the line, and we have all of the problems of the disads triggering before then. And so I think this might be a route that a lot of teams actually end up going down. I can think of like a few of the nibs from the high-speed rail topic might carry over. Things like the eminent domain stuff and lawsuits. There might be complications with nuclear energy. This is compounded by the fact that a lot of people just are scared of nuclear energy. So it's kind of like a NIMBY effect. Like no one wants to be near the nuclear reactors. And so if you try to put it in X community, maybe they will say, no, get it out of here. You should put it over there instead. Or if you're able to successfully put it there, maybe they will tangle it up in lawsuits so that it takes even longer to construct the nuclear reactors. And that might create some problems. But okay, let's talk about how the debate probably will go in most reasonable rounds. I think there's basically two assumptions that people will use. There's one that will definitely be dominant as far as the debates that I've seen in the past. And then there's a secondary assumption that might be used for a number of other arguments. So assumption A, I call it, is that energy will stay constant in either world. So nuclear energy will just replace other energy. It's the mix of energy that changes, the proportion of energy that is produced by different kinds of energy production. So, for example, the pie stays the same size, right? But the slice of the pie taken up by wind energy or solar energy or fossil fuels will shrink or grow depending on the influence of nuclear energy. Probably shrink, right? Most of these arguments intuitively are going to be that as nuclear energy increases, we see a replacement of other energy. The reason for the trade-off, actually the most straightforward reason for the trade-off, is just because there's a pretty finite amount of energy demand at any given moment, and this influences the energy economy. People only need to use so much energy. I don't need extra energy. I don't really want to pay for extra energy if I'm like not using it, right? So I only use so much air conditioning in my house, so much energy to power the lights, etc. Businesses, technology, you name it, they require maybe more energy in different times, but the amount of supply of energy scales pretty much just linearly with the amount of demand. So anytime anyone wants more energy is typically produced very quickly to meet that demand. And it's sort of priced in. It's like the market balances and adapts to the changes in demand. This means that I think it's very intuitive to make the argument that as you increase nuclear energy, people just don't need as much energy from the other sources, and so those sources produce less energy. You have less investment maybe into those other sources as well. That's the most intuitive warrant for the trade-off. People will also make other warrants, like maybe there's a political trade-off. There's only so much political capital that is spent on investing in energy policy. Maybe there's like a resource trade-off within the government budget. Like maybe the Trump administration has only allocated X amount of money to investing in domestic energy. And so if more of it goes to nuclear, then maybe less of it goes to other kinds of energy, etc. But I really think that the demand argument is probably the most intuitive. It's not that there's like a material trade-off between them. It's that you don't need as much of the other energy kinds if you use more nuclear. The second assumption that might happen is kind of the opposite. The idea is that maybe nuclear energy does not replace other energy, it actually just adds more energy. So the argument here is we are actually in like an energy crisis right now. We don't have enough energy in general, or at least a lot of people are not getting the energy that they need. And so one solution is to increase the total amount of energy that we produce in order to meet demand. The argument would be demand for energy is currently outpacing supply. I don't think this is true, but people have made this argument in the past. One interesting nuance of this argument is specific technologies. So some people will make an argument that technologies that are very like futuristic high-tech things like carbon capture technology, where we suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, are feasible if they have enough energy, and they currently don't have enough energy. And so the argument goes, we don't have enough energy for carbon capture. Nuclear energy can provide enough energy to fuel carbon capture, and that will allow the carbon capture markets to capture more investment and start actually creating carbon capture technology. The same argument applies to a lot of other technologies. Like I can imagine people saying we need nuclear energy to power the grid, to power high-speed rail lines, or we need nuclear energy to power water purification was a big one in 2020. These arguments are interesting because on the surface, they appear to rely on what I call assumption B, which is that energy is additive. You just get more when you add nuclear energy. But I don't think they necessarily have to because I don't know. Maybe people will say like only nuclear energy can produce this energy efficiently enough in like a burst that this technology specifically needs. Or like maybe there's some like logistical problem with the other kinds of energy. I'm not really convinced by these arguments. Like at the end of the day, like energy is energy, right? If it's connected to the grid, then it doesn't really matter how you got the energy there. The carbon capture technology doesn't care if it's nuclear flavored energy or if it's fossil fuel flavored energy. But I know that like there are articles out there that make the claim at least that like only nuclear energy has enough energy that we can power this technology. Uh, I think it's safe to say, though, I'm just pretty skeptical of those claims. But yeah, I think that's like basically where the topic stands for me is either you will be arguing that there is a trade-off between nuclear energy and other kinds of energy, or you will be arguing that it is additive and that we will use the new energy for something good or something bad. Okay. I think I said this already, but I think assumption A is going to be dominant, like very strongly dominant. Probably at least 80% of the arguments on the topic will be using assumption A, and so they will be like trade-off arguments. All of these arguments, therefore, need to be comparative. You cannot make an argument that nuclear energy is dangerous without making the argument that nuclear energy is more dangerous compared to whatever energy it is replacing. And so I think there are a lot of different debates that actually get produced. And you need to be ready for all of them. And you need to be able to compare between each of the debates as well. So Sort of crudely, I've made a list of four. This is obviously an artificial list. Like you could rearrange it to make it like a list of eight or something. It's just the point is you just need to be ready to compare nuclear energy to any other kind of energy, either that we are using instead or that we will use instead in the future. So the dominant debates are going to be nuclear energy against fossil fuels and probably nuclear energy against the classic renewables, like a mix of wind energy and solar energy. You'll also see energy debates about like natural gas. Like people will say nuclear energy trades off with natural gas, and most of them will say that's a good thing, similar to the fossil fuels arguments. Maybe there's some other independent DAs to like fracking. And then sometimes you will very rarely see some arguments about how nuclear energy trades off with other like weird kinds of energy, things like hydropower, geothermal, hydrogen fuel. Maybe you'll find some other like weird, funky energy. Maybe someone will make an argument that like we are on the cusp of creating this brand new kind of energy that's amazing. And if we invest too much in nuclear energy, then there's like a direct trade-off between the two. But mostly, I think we're focusing on this debate about fossil fuels and this debate about classic renewables. Every time you answer any of these questions about, is nuclear energy better than fossil fuels? Is it better than classic renewables? There are a few different ways that you can answer the question. Primarily, I think there are sort of three dimensions. It's like the price, the space, and the risks. And price will include like the variability, for example. It's technically slightly different because there will be some arguments about blackouts. But for the most part, like if you're making an argument that nuclear energy is better than wind energy because the wind energy only works when the wind blows, but the nuclear energy works 24/7, really you're making an argument probably that nuclear energy is cheaper than wind energy because logically we can just add a battery and then just like more wind power so that even when the wind stops blowing, we generated so much energy from when it was blowing and we're just keeping it here, so we're okay even when the wind is not blowing. The problem with that is, A, people will say the technology for the batteries is not good enough. But really what this means is like, it's not true that we don't have the batteries. We sort of do have batteries. The problem is they're very expensive, and they will likely continue to be very expensive for quite a long time. And so that is just translated into cost for the consumer down the line, which really just means your argument, if you say nuclear energy is less variable, is that it is cheaper. Um, Probably. Technically, again, there's this impact about blackouts, but I think this is slightly less likely. At least it doesn't seem like it has great uniqueness. There are not too many blackouts that I know of in the US that cause major problems. And if they are, doesn't seem like something that nuclear energy can necessarily solve. Um, the second dimension is space, like land use. People are going to ignore this one, I think. Like, who cares about how much space it takes up? I actually think this is a very good dimension that you can compare, especially for the AF, because it seems like from my research, it's just true that nuclear energy takes up like enormously less space per unit of energy produced than any other kind of energy, be it fossil fuels or renewable. The problem is like, what the heck is the impact? But I think there's three routes at least you could go down that seem pretty promising to me and have pretty good literature. Like one is agriculture. You get rid of a lot of agricultural land when you fill it all with solar panels instead. Two is the housing crisis stuff, like the value of land goes up or the price of land goes up when you have less of it, supply and demand, right? And so this exacerbates the problem of the housing crisis. Like more of the land is higher priced, that there's less space to build houses, there are less houses, there's a higher price for each of the house. And that seems like a bad thing. And number three is maybe the most promising. Maybe, arguably. There's like biodiversity arguments, like deforestation arguments. Maybe we need to like clear a forest in order to set up our windmills, or we need to like herd a bunch of fish in the water to make offshore windmills. I'm not sure how convinced I am by that argument. But at least I think there's something promising in there, especially since the link is so strong on the AF. The last dimension that you can compare is the risks. And this is where like most of the arguments are going to fall. So these are just negative externalities that could possibly be produced when you produce this energy. Um, Go-to examples are like meltdown DA. So this is just nuclear reactors could explode. Look at Chernobyl, look at Fukushima, and that would produce clearly terrible effects. The meltdown DA is interesting because it has cool like short circuit weighing that you can run um, with an interesting sort of scope flavor as well, where you can say if there is a meltdown, this will dismantle the nuclear industry afterwards, just like what happened after Fukushima. And this will probably spread globally as well. So if there's a meltdown here in the US, it means that nuclear plants in other countries will probably be shut down, at least some of them, or will be stopped and inspected, whatever the case. And this means that a lot of the benefits the AF talks about might stop happening or even might be reversed on net. It's kind of a hard argument to say that they would be reversed on net, but it's an interesting one, right? Like, I don't know. I think that there's something there that can allow you to at least get some easier chances to do the rest of your weighing afterwards. Um, the other risks that you can imagine, nuclear waste is also a huge one. Like all nuclear power produces some waste. There's a lot of articles online that say it's actually not that bad. It's like it doesn't really affect humans too terribly. And it's like fairly easy to contain, but it does last for like basically forever. At the very least, it still remains dangerous for like a few centuries. And we haven't really found like a great way to contain it yet. To add to that, a lot of the problems with nuclear waste are that countries, including the US, have a history of sort of just shoving it onto marginalized groups, more specifically indigenous land. Those people typically have somewhat less political power to fight for their rights in democracies or in any political system. And so it's unfortunately the case that oftentimes they are the ones who bear the brunt of the burden of things like nuclear waste. But at the same time, I want to make sure that everyone is clear that these all need to be comparative arguments. A lot of teams are going to make the mistake of just reading it like a nuclear waste DA and just saying like uniqueness, there's no nuclear waste right now or very little. Link, you add a bunch of new nuclear waste. Impact, this gets put on indigenous land and maybe it poisons people, and that's going to be where they finish. But this is technically, in my opinion, an incomplete argument as long as we are using assumption A, because what you're really saying is that there's a higher amount of negative externalities from producing energy with nuclear than from producing energy with whatever energy mix it would replace. And this might not actually even be true, even if your DA is correct. For example, it's very easy for the AF to stand up in the next speech and just say, you forgot to compare this to fossil fuels. That's the most likely energy that's going to be replaced. And fossil fuels produce even worse waste that also affects indigenous people. And it affects them in worse ways than nuclear waste. And if you aren't ready for this, this is like basically GG. Like this is like the cleanest link turn I could imagine on your DA, and it makes it very difficult for you to win, to say the least. So every single argument you read here on the AF that says other energy has more risks, or on the neg that says nuclear energy has high risks, all of those need to be compared, and they specifically need to be compared to whatever energy you think is going to be replaced. So you have sort of this calculation with X price and Y land and Z risks. You get like one new unit of energy, and that's what you need to compare. However, there is one more dimension, and this is sort of something I've been hinted at, which is like the percent chance that this is the energy that is traded off with. Um, some teams will argue fossil fuels are going to be the only energy that is replaced. Other teams will argue renewables are going to be the only energy that is replaced. The truth is somewhere in between. Like it's probably going to be a mix of everything that is replaced, but to different extents. So, in order to win your comparative, let's say you have an argument that depends on comparing nuclear energy to fossil fuels, and they have an argument that depends on comparing nuclear energy to renewables. You have to say one of three things. One, you can say it is more likely that nuclear energy trades off with fossil fuels than with renewables. Two, even if it trades off with both, it trades off with fossil fuels more. And really, one and two are kind of the same thing. Or three, let's pretend that it trades off equally with both. Even then, the difference between fossil fuels and nuclear energy along our argument is bigger than the difference between nuclear energy and renewables for your argument, which means that you just sort of do classical weighing there. But it's important to know that you have to weigh between these different comparatives that are happening. Um, there is one more case, we'll call it like a fourth case, where you can actually get away with conceding that most of the energy that is replaced is the one that their argument depends on, and that actually the energy that your argument depends on is not being replaced very much at all. And you can still win the debate if you have enough of a good argument with weighing. So, for example, I've constructed a sort of a thought experiment here where we can pretend that the neg is proving that there's like 90% of the energy that is replaced by nuclear is renewables, like solar and wind. And we can also give the neg, if we're being really charitable, we can pretend that they are winning, that renewable energy is like twice as clean as nuclear energy. All of these different kinds of energy have some kind of pollution, some kind of CO2 equivalent emissions over their lifetimes, even if it's not happening during the stage of energy production. It's at the very least it's happening when you construct the thing or you clean up the waste or you dismantle it afterwards. And so let's pretend the neg is proving nuclear energy is twice as dirty as renewables, and 90% of the energy that is replaced is renewable. Only 10% is fossil fuels. The AF can still, I think, fairly easily win the warming advantage, and say that there's like a net decrease in carbon equivalents and a net decrease in emissions. If they just point out some basic math, because the fact of the matter, and I'm using made up numbers here, but the fact of the matter is that fossil fuels are like enormously worse than either nuclear energy or renewables. And it might be true that renewables are cleaner than nuclear energy, but it's kind of like you're comparing a super clean energy to like a super duper clean energy when there's this incredibly dirty energy over here that is obvious. It makes both of them look basically the same in comparison. It doesn't really matter if you have a semi-perfect solution or a perfect solution. The most important delta, the most important difference in the debate is how much fossil fuels there is. And so, for example, I tried to demonstrate that here. Like, we can pretend that fossil fuels are like 100 times more dirty than either nuclear or renewables. And if you assume that, which is actually quite easy to prove, I think the numbers might even be more staggering. Then even if you agree with the neg that it's 90% renewable trade-off and only 10% fossil fuel trade-off, you get like a tenfold decrease in emissions. Um, which I think demonstrates how this weighing can be done, even if you are behind on which comparative is happening to a greater extent. Um, Last stuff, I guess you should also consider the current composition of the energy mix. So even if it is very likely that like geothermal power it trades off with nuclear power, there's just not that much of it. So like maybe nuclear energy eats up all of the geothermal and then it keeps going. And so like maybe it's 100% likely that it trades off with geothermal, but then there's so much more energy we're producing with nuclear that it just also trades off with other things afterwards. So knowing how much of the current energy mix is dominated by the energy you're talking about might also be important in some cases. Um, okay, so this is actually quite important because I've seen a lot of teams read advantages, for example, on the AF that seemingly operate with contradictory assumptions. A lot of teams, for instance, would read like advantage one, we need to solve energy poverty. There are a lot of people who don't have enough electricity, so we need more energy, and nuclear energy adds to the current energy mix to give these people electricity. Advantage two is warming. Nuclear energy trades off with fossil fuels. The fossil fuels will all go away. This allows us to have a more clean environment with less emissions. Fine. But these are both operating on assumptions that are like inherently in tension. It's possible for both to be true. Like it's possible, and it probably is true to some extent, that you do add some amount of energy when you invest more in energy, but it's also true that you trade off to some extent with other energy that would exist otherwise. The problem is, I think that it's probably much more true that you trade off with other energy than it is true that it is additive, which can pretty easily take away any arguments that use assumption B. But if you want to be even more strategic, you could get them to concede assumption B is true and that assumption A is not true. In Crossfire, for example, if they aren't thinking enough about how their arguments depend on this. So, for instance, what that would look like is you can push them on this like energy poverty advantage in Crossfire, and you can say, okay, for your energy poverty advantage, this argument seems to rely on the assumption that nuclear energy actually adds extra energy to the mix of energy we already have, and it doesn't take away any energy. Is that true? And then they'll say yes, of course. And you'll be like, okay, so to be clear, then you're saying that other energy does not go away. We're adding more nuclear energy. Um, because if other energy goes away, that might like create more energy poverty, right? Or at least there won't be a net increase in energy. And so no one will get new energy. You'll just change what kind of energy they're using. And then they'll probably double down and be like, no, 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 it is additive. There's actually new energy that's being used. It doesn't get rid of other energy. And then you can concede that in the next speech and be like, haha, this means that your warming advantage is wrong because it depends on actually reducing fossil fuels. But you just told us in Crossfire that it's additive and it doesn't trade off with other energy. Even if they walk back on this later, at the very least, it's probably not a very significant trade-off if most of it is additive, which means that you can like almost zero out their link. At the very least, this is very heavy mitigation on their link that will allow us to outweigh it later in the round. So some strategic considerations to think about that stem from these assumptions. There are some arguments that people are going to throw around that don't use any of these assumptions. They're not really in the energy debate at all. Most of these are like reactions. So politics arguments, people are going to make arguments about like riders and concessions, like, oh, the normal means the Democrats have to fight for nuclear energy, and so they'll have to give up other things in the process. Maybe they'll like give a bunch of sweet deals to the oil lobby in order to get this bill past the like super strong lobbyists. In that case, maybe there will be actually negative things for the climate or other negative things for the world in general. I'm still a little bit skeptical of these kind of arguments on any topic, but certainly people will make these like political capital and elections arguments and like writers and concessions arguments. There's also arguments about lobbying. So there's interesting things about the dynamics of like the energy lobby between like the people who are lobbying for renewables and the people who are lobbying for nuclear and the people who are lobbying for fossil fuels and like how they all interact with each other. And you probably strengthen the nuclear lobby when you invest more in it. Um, and so there are interesting implications of that. Public perception might be a big thing, like especially on the neg, likely. The neg will make arguments maybe that people don't like nuclear energy, even if it's irrational to fear it. And that might, create complications for the implementation of the policy. Lawsuits might be one of those complications, for example. There also will likely be global arguments. So people will make a lot of arguments about spillover. Spillover, how maybe other countries see the US using more nuclear energy and they say, hey, we should do that too. We set sort of an example for other countries, or we like create new nuclear technology through this investment and that spills over. Maybe the norms spill over somehow, like we create regulations to deal with this new influx of nuclear energy. And that like positions us better to be a global leader in nuclear energy and force other nations to regulate their own nuclear energy in different ways. There might also be some IR stuff. So I'm thinking like one argument that popped into my head was like maybe other countries get scared that the US is starting to develop more nuclear warheads because there's this sort of kind of a myth that nuclear energy for domestic civilian use is a prerequisite to like enriching more uranium to build more nuclear warheads. The reason I say it's a myth is because as it turns out, really like there are two kinds of nuclear reactors. One is the kind we're talking about that generates civilian energy, and the other one, which is very clearly different, is called an R&D reactor, and that is the kind of reactor that actually makes like enriched uranium for warheads. It is technically possible to use the nuclear waste and put it and like make crude nuclear weapons with it, but it's like really, really hard and it doesn't really help you very much. Having the nuclear, like the domestic civilian nuclear energy, does not, it gets you like one step toward a nuclear arsenal, whereas like countries like the USA, they don't need that. Like, A, we already have an arsenal, but B, you would just use the R&D reactors to get you like 100 steps closer to the nuclear arsenal instead of just doing one step. So I don't think that this argument is true. But people have this pro-life argument every time we have a nuclear debate, even if the word domestic is in there. I remember last time there were some arguments about how like US nuclear technology would spill over to other countries and then they would use it to enrich uranium and that would create like nuclear prolif. I think these arguments are pretty nonsense, but technically like they exist. I'm sure someone is going to try to make them. Um, so yeah, the reactions are interesting arguments. I think the links are fairly weak on most of them, but they are certainly going to be, somewhat common at the TOC. So don't be surprised if you see them. Other considerations, these are questions that should get you thinking more about how you should like prep this topic. Maybe there's induced demand, maybe energy demand changes slightly. I think probably not. How is energy allocated? This is a big one. I was talking earlier about how there might be some arguments about how like we need more nuclear energy for carbon capture or water purification. One problem with these arguments is like it's missing a warrant. You need to explain why it is likely that the administration uses nuclear energy for those uses instead of just like helping big businesses or something. Um, and do different kinds of energy get allocated differently? Why? And why would nuclear energy be different? And actually, that's a good point. The implementation of this resolution can potentially be a big deal. For example, investment in nuclear energy is actually somewhat vague. We don't really know what kinds of nuclear energy are going to be invested in. We don't know if how the investment will be driven or if it will be like induced private investment or if it's all government money. Where does the money come from, etc. There are some cost arguments on this topic as well. Can nuclear energy increase any other kinds of energy instead of trading off with them? I've heard this argument in the context of like the AF might say that nuclear energy will strengthen renewable energy by providing sort of backup energy. Like whenever the sun is not shining, you can use nuclear energy instead of fossil fuels. And so that might actually generate more attraction for renewables as well, maybe more investment in them. I've also heard an argument that like the nuclear industry also is partnering in this like devious relationship with the fossil fuel lobby. And so like actually if you give more money to the nuclear companies, they will like give more money to the fossil fuel companies and you wind up getting more fossil fuels. I don't know if that's true, but like it's worth looking into these arguments because if they are true, they will significantly change the debate. Where do we get our energy from geographically as well? I know that there will be arguments about energy independence, like we should produce more energy domestically, period. Nuclear is just one way to do that. Maybe this creates less dependence on oil. This is a good thing for some international relations. Maybe we are less dependent on bad actors that we do bad things for in order to get oil. Or maybe we just are like less hungry for oil in general, so we don't go and like get involved in wars where we otherwise would not have interest in getting involved in them. That seems like it might be an important thing. We can also, like the US also makes up a fairly significant portion of global demand for oil. So if US demand for oil declines as a result of a trade-off or like a balloon effect from nuclear energy, it might allow us to have more of a soft landing when the amount of fossil fuels and oil we have inevitably declines, right? Like it is a finite resource, and we seem to be significantly outpacing supply with our demand. The future projections are pretty grim for the shocks that might occur from having less and less accessible oil. So one way to create like sort of a soft landing into that world is at least easing us in with some more nuclear energy and other energy alternatives along the way, but we have to start now. How long does it take to implement the policy? I remember some teams on the warming advantage will make the argument like the warming advantage is wrong because nuclear energy takes like 20 years to make, and we only have like 10 years left, or we only have 5 years left to hit climate targets. That's a little bit artificial. Um, those numbers are a little bit made up. Like the whole argument is scalar. It's sort of exponential, but it's true that there are some points at which we hit like positive feedback loops. Like if the Earth gets hot enough, then it starts melting the permafrost in the Arctic, and that frees up more black carbon that makes the Earth hotter. Um, but I don't think like a lot of people make it seem like climate change is either going to happen or not going to happen, or like past the point of no return or not. But climate change is like a process, not an event, right? So I'm a little bit skeptical of these arguments, but it is true that nuclear energy takes a long, long time to set up. But I'm also skeptical that like people try to pair this with the renewables trade-off. But why would there be a renewables trade-off now and then later we start producing energy from nuclear? Like again, the demand for energy will probably stay constant. And so if we aren't starting to produce energy from nuclear energy because it hasn't been constructed yet, then it doesn't seem very rational that like suddenly everyone will stop using energy from renewables. People will probably make like a funding trade-off argument, but even this I'm fairly skeptical of given the relatively fixed demand for energy in the currently pretty free market of energy that we have in the US. Does it come in the form of constructing new nuclear plants or renovating old ones? That might be an important question. How long does that take? What technology is involved? I'll get to that later as well. Also, how might nuclear energy change in the future? For example, is there more innovation that will happen that will like fix all of the bad problems? Maybe we will run out of good uranium that's easily accessible. Like, uranium is also not finite, although it is like a lot more abundant than people think. Um, we're taking all of the low-hanging fruit, so it gets harder and harder over time to go mine for uranium, and that makes it more expensive and also sort of expensive in terms of energy as well, right? Like we need to fuel all of the whatever, like the pods that go down in the ground and like mine for the uranium, and that's energy that is being spent with a fixed amount of energy that we get back. The energy being spent is increasing over time, so the sort of the net energy that we get from nuclear decreases over time, which is not true, by the way, for the sun. Okay, the rest of this document, I'm not going to get into too much, but it's just like a few more details. It's not completely fleshed out yet. But there's one section I want to talk about a lot, which is this one. I think we need to characterize what nuclear energy looks like to have this debate. And a lot of that will be about technology. So, what kinds of technologies are we looking at with nuclear energy? Things have changed a lot since like Fukushima in 2011. There are four maybe technologies that I think people will mention a lot. One is like advanced fast reactors that can recycle nuclear waste. People will use this as defense against the nuclear waste argument. They'll just say, just put it back in, and then it doesn't poison anyone. It's not on indigenous land. Number two is fusion reactors. There's like evidence that maybe some of them are set to go online in like 2028 or something like that. This is not really commercially viable yet, and I don't think the fast reactors really are super commercially viable either. Like all of these technologies are very expensive and they're still in their infancy, more or less. But fusion is like a totally different process that produces even more energy with maybe different problems, at least, probably fewer problems than fission. Number three is thorium reactors. I watched like a YouTube video on thorium reactors back in the day, and it seems like they're pretty great. They're like perfect. They don't have any problems. And four is SMRs, which are small modular reactors. I don't know that much about them, but like people say that they're really good. I would be skeptical of any argument that says like this is like a flawless kind of energy production. It has no problems whatsoever. For a lot of these, maybe we just don't know what the problems are yet. But I think these are pretty good paths that the AF can use to escape a lot of the DAs from the neg. They are somewhat like it's unclear how likely these are to actually be major, and it's further unclear if this is what the administration would choose to invest in. For example, I don't know. It seems like with Doge and everything happening in the US government, we aren't super keen on investing in the most expensive kinds of things. Although at the same time, like, hey, like Elon Musk seems like a tech bro, so maybe he likes fusion reactors. But who knows, right? You need to debate that out yourselves. What kinds of innovations are the government going to be is the government going to be pursuing? And where is the investment in nuclear energy actually going to go? Last thing I'll say here is the investment itself might change what nuclear energy looks like. There's an interesting argument or like a strategy that the AF can push that says if we invest more in nuclear energy, that investment will solve the problems that the neg is talking about. Like the investment into nuclear energy will be done in such a way that it produces changes in nuclear energy, like innovations that solve the problems the neg talks about. And so actually those link cards on the neg, those are actually just uniqueness cards for the AF that we solve with investment. Yes, there are problems now. That's exactly what we're trying to solve. And actually, that means that those problems happen more on your side, and they happen only if you don't have enough investment to like fix them. Um, which could be a cool strategy to interestingly like kind of link turn some of the neg, especially if those innovations that are produced by the investment then spill over globally. Okay, these are all the different kinds of energy that might be replaced. Again, probably a mix of all of these will be replaced, but like each one to a different degree. Um, yeah, I think that's mostly what I want to talk about. The last thing I'll say is like, here is a brief list of arguments. It's very crude. I spent like an hour on this. I think the AF will say it solves climate change, solves air pollution, helps the economy because there's like cheaper energy primarily, or because our dependence on fossil fuels will crush the economy if we don't get off of them. Oil wars is a similar argument. Energy independent stuff. Maybe there's like a Saudi Arabia argument. Energy poverty, renewables are bad arguments. There might be like rare earth minerals stuff. Um, Powers cool technology like carbon capture, high-speed rail, or water purification. There'll be some defense like the investment can solve the DAs or the regulations can solve the DAs. Or, and I should add this here, this will be the most common one, right? Like tech solves the DAs, like fusion reactors, thorium reactors, whatever. You can save more land. I talked about that. Or like the grid gets more resilient. There are fewer blackouts. The neg will say they explode. They will say that renewables are better, and that's where the trade-off happens. They're better for the climate, for instance. They'll say that there's more nuclear waste, and that gets put on indigenous land, and it poisons people. The miners who mine for the uranium get sick. There's a high cost of using nuclear energy. Maybe like the government spends less on other things as a result, but again, the uniqueness on that is a little bit compromised at the moment. It takes too long to make and run the nuclear energy, especially if there are extra complications from like politics and public perception and like lawsuits. Maybe there's like weird like pro-life arguments, public backlash, the politics stuff like free riders, spike in nuclear demand. Oh, this is an interesting argument. If we like suddenly invest more in nuclear energy, it might increase demand for nuclear energy above the amount of supply that currently exists, which might increase like the price of global nuclear energy. I think this might be a bad argument for a number of reasons, but I wanted to add everything I could think of. This would like link turn some of the arguments on the app though. Like maybe we take away nuclear energy from other countries to use it here. There's some defense like nuclear stops working when the water gets too hot, which is true, and probably increasingly true as we experience more climate change. And if there is, oh, this is a fun, sort of a fun, fancy one. If there's a bad accident in a different country, so even if you're right about regulations and tech here, if there's a bad accident in a different country, that will actually crush the industry everywhere, including in the US. And this is historically true of Fukushima, which means like even if nuclear is perfect, the problem is it won't last consistently enough. So it will suddenly stop, so we will suddenly have a spike in demand for fossil fuels then, and it's not sustainable enough for us to use it as a viable solution against climate change, for example, or other things. There's an argument about fish and just pick your favorite sea animal. I've heard people make like krill arguments. Why is this the case? Because nuclear reactors typically need like a bunch of water to cool them down, and then they put the water back in the ocean sometimes, and it's like super hot. Um, a lot of it is seawater, but this argument seems false. Unfortunately, I do love my fish arguments, but I think it's at least exaggerated. Or maybe we run out of good uranium, and that makes it like super either energy intensive in the future, which requires more fossil fuels, or expensive in the future and just not viable. Um, okay, this topic has also been debated in LD and PF in the past. The wiki I was looking at, the wiki only really started being a thing in like 2019 for PF, but the 2020 wiki actually has some stuff on the nuclear topic. It's not like you're gonna cringe at it, right? But like there are arguments there, there are cards there. And I think there's some stuff on the policy wiki as well. I was looking at like logos, for instance. I've got like some notes here from some Logos arguments or some Logos cards. So policy uses nuclear energy now and then as well. So there's a good amount of prep that has already been done on the topic that you can go look at. But again, I would encourage you to first probably read the news, think for yourself, analyze the topic before hopping into other people's prep and just sort of stealing cards. Okay, that is my topic analysis, my preliminary topic analysis on nuclear energy. I'm ready to have my mind changed by a bunch of masters with different debate backgrounds. So I'm super excited to start interviewing people who have a lot of different thoughts about debate and a lot of different thoughts about this topic. And I hope that that is something that can change your perspective on PF as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very soon.